This German giant has everything that's been on my CRT bucket list. Scart RGB, a curved glass 16:9 screen, and multi-format. I'm just shitting ya, it's 15 kHz only. But the upside is there's no 100Hz processing, which means proper 240p and zero lag. How do I know it's not 100Hz? Well, the documentation for the 2058 Grundig chassis states that it's 50Hz. Light gun games work just fine, and for solid proof, this Extron 118 Plus with a scan rate indicator reached the horizontal frequency at around 15 kHz, and the vertical rate hovers around 60 Hz. Before lifting this beast onto its podium, I did the usual inspection of the internals, with the anode cap re-grease and cleaned out the 20-year-old dust. It's got a 76cm 30-inch Thomson tube, a decent set of 8-ohm speakers, and 2 SCART sockets that support PAL and NTSC composite, S-video, and RGB. This isn't my first standard def widescreen set, and so far none have been up to par. A TV wasn't the first thing I found when I googled Bush. And this one is also a 15 kHz widescreen with Scart RGB. 50Hz RGB looks okay, but it does some weird processing of 60Hz RGB with an ugly yellow tint, so it's going to be rehomed. It's a fair question why I'd want a standard def widescreen CRT, so I'll explain. Man, I just love everything about Phone Dork's videos. The humour, the quality of his CRT footage, and he had the foresight to document his experience through Pro Monitor perfection. The showcase of the BVM D24 was the pinnacle in the series, which is a widescreen multi-format CRT that's capable of resolutions as low as 240p and up to 1080i. It's simply perfect for having all video sources and aspect ratios compatible in a single CRT, displaying all resolutions natively without additional scaling. As much as I'd love to own a D24 or D32, I know that there's quality consumer sets that can be found for much cheaper. Plus, I prefer gaming on a larger set than a smaller Pro monitor, even when accounting for multi-format capabilities. Widescreen HD CRTs are plentiful, but aren't as sought after because they upscale 240p incorrectly by interpreting as 480i. I know I could upscale 240p content externally, but in my eyes I might as well buy an OLED. But seeing most of my gaming is 240p, and having seen how good 480i looks from an HD console, I figured I'd go with a standard def widescreen. There's more retro games than you'd think that can display in widescreen. GoldenEye 007 on the N64 is one of the more known titles to have a 16:9 mode. Here's the default 4:3 mode. Now take note of the red and white barrier to the right as a point of reference of what we can see in stretched mode. Now we go into the start menu and turn on 16:9 to render the game in proper widescreen. Notice there's more viewable background to the right of the barrier whilst displaying the graphics in the correct ratio. Enemies can be seen in peripheries of the game and you can have a more cinematic experience. There's an online homebrew scene for widescreen patches that can be played on original hardware using a flash cart. Here's Super Mario Kart 64 played in RGB with de-blur, and patches for anti-aliasing, widescreen, and vertical split-screen 2-player. With the patch applied, the game renders all 3D objects in anamorphic widescreen and it looks stunning. I don't feel any compromise to performance, especially frame rate. I'll be honest though, applying patches to ROMs is tedious, let alone finding a patch for a game that you really want to play. And then there's no guarantee the game will run without issues. Through my research into other consoles that were capable of rendering in a wide resolution, I found a pretty cool and streamlined method that'll render 16:9 for most 3D games, with varying results.
It's a PlayStation 4. No.
Oh, yeah.
The Sony PlayStation was my first console I owned that was current for its time. And thank God I got one. And I literally mean thank God. My family put in and bought me one for my Holy Communion. so it's always ranked high as one of my favorite consoles of all time. The PS1 is powerful enough to render games in 16:9 with the help of GameShark codes, and the amazing developers behind the PS1 Core have seamlessly implemented this. You simply load up a game and then go into the Cores menu and turn on 16:9. It blows my mind that anamorphic widescreen is this accessible. It can improve the look of the game, but will it enhance playability? It's not at all flawless for every game. Take Crash Bandicoot for example, which has some pretty distracting pop-in artifacts. I know Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2 off the back of my hand, and I know the game also suffers from mild pop-in, and there's additional artifact that I notice every so often in 16:9. But I guess that's because my eyes are drawn to the lateral portion of the image while I'm testing these hacks. And I don't think it would be any more distracting if I were more focused on the gameplay, say in career mode. But when 16:9 does work without pop-in and doesn't restrict the player within the confines of the 4:3 area, it feels like the game was always designed with widescreen in mind. Here's an example of R-type delta that restricts the player to the 4:3 area. Notice the confines of movement are the same when in 16:9, which is detrimental to gameplay. I guess for obvious reasons, 2D assets can't be properly rendered in 16:9. If I try this hack on my favorite homoerotic shooter, the game still plays in 4:3. Same goes for 2D fighters like Capcom's classic titles. So I knew this probably wasn't going to work, but I tried the NES emulator for the PS1 that plays proper 240p, and it can't render in 16:9. Point Blank 3 is a 2D game and therefore can't be rendered in anamorphic widescreen. But the light gun has no problem tracking the screen when using the TV's internal 16:9 stretching mode. This was always my favourite light gun game, and needing to make more drastic left and right movements adds a layer of complexity. But I'm having fun with it, so that's all that really matters. I've got to contain myself here, because last time I played Point Blank on a larger TV, I got so immersed I was doing front rolls and put a hole through the wall. 480i 7th gen consoles in component or RGB looks damn impressive. Sure, it's never going to look as good as 1080p, but to me, and even when later gen consoles are rendered in 480p 4:3 or 1080i 16:9 on a 20L5, I still prefer the lower resolution interlaced image of the larger Grundig. Convenience in my setup is my number one priority, and I have my 7th gen and later consoles running through an HDMI matrix switcher. One output goes to my 110-inch projector at 1080p, and the other output is downscaled to 480i widescreen to play on my CRT. I know that most of these consoles can output 480i analog RGB natively, but this means that I don't need to change cables between analog and digital, and I don't need to change the resolution in the system menu when I switch from one display to the other. I bought this HDMI to component DAC, and it turned out to be a hidden gem with an inbuilt scaler capable of outputting 50 and 60Hz video up to 1080p and downscaling as low as 480i. I'd drop a link in the description, but I bought it so long ago that I can't seem to find it online. Given its scaling capabilities, there has to be some lag to hold each frame to process, but it's nothing that I can noticeably detect. And for those of you that love razor-sharp 240p, here's the switch outputting HDMI to a transcoder to feed 480p component into a modified GBS 8200, which downscales 240p and outputs RGB HV into an RGB interface to combine the HV sync to RGB-S. God damn, that was a mouthful. Text always looks butchered when downscaling this low, and there's too much loss in detail, and I much prefer the look of HD downscale to 480i rather than 240p. It's just preference, but even if I did prefer 240p, I'm reluctant to go this route with the number of devices I need to achieve this. Another option to downscale HD video is this Extron VSC 500. You feed in HDMI into a VGA converter directly into the Extron, which then outputs 480i in component or whatever format of RGB you need. You can use these dials to move the picture and stretch it however you like. The PSP outputs a beautiful 240p signal for PS1 games, but because the PSP lacks an internal scaler, all PSP games are windowed to its native resolution of 480 by 272, which is an odd aspect ratio of 30 by 17. But you can almost consider this to be 16 by 9, as it's only an extra 2 columns of vertical pixels from this ratio. The Extron VSC works really well for stretching the PSP's video to fill the entire 16 by 9 area, and even if it's a non-integer scale with vertical stretching, there won't be any noticeable scaling artifacts for games that use 3D polygons. The image, however, is noticeably softer as a result, but I had cleaner results when I ditched the Extron and just output 480i component through an RGB transcoder and let the Grundig Cinema option stretch the image. My component to RGB transcoder of choice is the Garo made by the Behar brothers. It's so far the only transcoder I've used that's not a G-Scart hog. The G-Scart will automatically switch to the input that has an active sync signal, and all the other transcoders I've used will output color bars even when there's no input, which prevents me from switching to another console unless I disconnect or power off that transcoder. But with the Garo, it won't output a signal if it's not receiving one, so I can just leave it turned on and plugged in without any concern of unwanted auto switching. The Grundig has 4 selectable video modes, from 4:3, panorama with incorrect aspect ratio, proper 16:9, and cinema mode, which I showed earlier with the PSP, which also stretches vertically to get rid of additional top and bottom black bars that you often see in movies. Watching a widescreen movie looks stunning on this set, and it means that I no longer have to crop zoom on the DVD remaster of Dragon Ball Z to watch it in full screen. But what good is a widescreen CRT for standard def 4:3 content? Well, as PhoneDork put it, widescreen is a one-size-fits-all because all 4:3 video should display perfectly within the viewable area. 240p in itself is a general term given to progressive 15 kHz analog video. But in reality, most consoles can output a number of resolutions within this realm, which results in picture shift and underscan with visible solid bars, or overscan which cuts off a portion of the screen. This won't necessarily affect gameplay, but with setups that allow for multiple consoles and cores, it becomes a little more noticeable. So if you can put up with black bars on either side of 4:3 content, then this can be a perfect all-in-one standard definition setup. But the only problem is that the Grundig has its own horizontal cutoff on the left of 4:3 content. Accessing the service menu with code 8500 automatically puts the TV back into 16:9 without any way of switching into 4:3. And adjusting the horizontal position unfortunately shifts the image along with the initial overscan, so you don't gain any extra visibility of the left side of 4:3 video. 4:3 content within a 30-inch 16:9 area measures to be about 24 inches. But these black bars aren't at all distracting thanks to the TV having very good black levels, so the sides aren't even noticeable when playing in a dark room. I'm also not concerned about 4:3 burn-in because I'd have to play a ton of exclusive 4:3 content for any noticeable phosphor wear. Geometry is fairly straight even if the grid kinks a little to the left. I was specifically wanting a curved widescreen for preference, but also because flat consumer CRTs tend to have poorer geometry. I like to use a grid scroll test to look for linearity defects, and all lines scroll with complete uniformity. And for reference, here's an example of poor horizontal linearity with a distracting barrel roll appearance. The focus within the 4:3 area is spot on, and then it blurs a little in the corners when in 16:9, which isn't surprising seeing there's a steeper angle to deflect in the far corners. The OSD displays together with RGB video sources for easy adjustments, unlike the Blaupunkt that I reviewed. But a good similarity to the Blaupunkt is the ability to leave the auxiliary cable plugged in for my headset without muting the TV speakers. An external sound output is activated by the remote. Even with its minor nuances in 4:3 horizontal overscan, I'd still say that this is the widescreen set that I've been looking for. Sure, it's no multi-format BVM, but for someone like myself that likes to watch movies and play consoles up to 7th gen on a CRT, I think that this TV is my one ring to rule them all. And playing PS1 games with seamless 16:9 switching has breathed new life into the console's library for me. Now, I'm not saying that everyone needs to go out and get a widescreen CRT, and everything I've shared is based on my own opinion and experience to streamline my setup. If there's other widescreen CRT lovers watching, or you want to see more CRT content, please subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. Thanks all for watching, and happy gaming.